Hello friends, and welcome back to this final part on the OT130. Let's just have a nice gentle start. We're going to paint up the tools. There isn't very many of them. I've already done the first step, which was undercoating the wooden handle portion with model colour silver grey. That was allowed to dry. And then we're going to use this transparent medium of natural wood grain. It's a semi-opaque medium, and it just gets brushed again all over the wooden handles of the tools and is allowed to dry. Once that's dry, we make up this brown glaze, again from Vallejo, with about 2 drops of water to 1 drop of the glaze, and it's applied onto the handles once again. But this time we actually deliberately rub or score the wood grain using this brush to try and draw in the wood grain. Just by dampening the brush in water, we can affect the pattern of wood, and then we're finished. Okay, let's just have a little study on what we're going to create next. Look at the vehicle carefully. Well, actually, very simply. Basically, a vehicle's been stood for some time. We said, maybe about a season. Water has washed off the majority of dust. So you can see that there's areas where water's going to bring everything off. So basically, it's quite a clean appearance. But also going to concentrate on 1 or 2 areas where we could put an accumulation of mud and dirt that was previous on the vehicle, and it's actually just stuck in these little corner areas. So that's exactly what we're going to do next. For this next stage, very similar to what we did in the previous video, we don't need that many materials. We're going to use some sand and gravel glue, some pigment fixer, pigments themselves, and of course the natural real earth that we used for the tracks. Okay, so full knowing where we're going to deposit these dust accumulations or muddy, dusty accumulations, we're going to use this micro brush. I find it very handy to use this brush as it can apply very small quantities, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to use a mixture of the pigment and the dirt and deposit into the corners and crevices to build up the 3-dimensional aspect of what would be mud that was washed into the corners and forms into these sort of piles. That's the best way I can describe it, really. But the main thing here is that it's not being pushed in like we did with the wet mud. We're actually just allowing gravity to do the work. So by just using the very small micro brush, taking a small amount of pigment, depositing where you want it, and repeating the process, we build up a very sort of small muddy layer. When we're applying the dirt, we're also trying to randomize a little bit the accumulation. So we're not putting in exactly the same amount in each corner, and also we're not putting exactly the same area, or else it looks a little bit too contrived, if you know what I mean. And also by adding this sort of random aspect of the accumulations, we create a more natural and random feel to the model. Now for the next stage, we don't want to disturb the way that we place the dust. So I use a pipette, and in this case we're using the pigment fixer. The idea is to allow capillary action to do the work. So you're quite careful with the pipette. I squeeze out a small drop of the liquid and then just bring it slightly into contact with the pigment dirt solution, so the actual liquid gets drawn out of the pipette. I don't put a drop on or put on large amounts. I want that liquid to just sort of be absorbed by the pigment without disturbing the actual location of it, or else it'll look a bit brushed on or it'll look a little bit too wet. You want to preserve the granularity of the pigment and the dirt. Also note the dirt accumulation around the Pioneer tools. This is a really great area. Obviously the tools may have been used, put back with mud still on them. Okay, after a period of I think about 8 or 9 hours, it does take quite a long time for the pigment fixer to dry out. You can see now how the pigment looks in its natural state. The liquid has been basically absorbed by the pigment, and also it's evaporated to some extent, and actually it does look pretty good just as it is. So the next stop is sort of optional to yourselves, but it's really what I do. I want a homogeneous effect, as I explained. So I want the dust that I've already used on the rest of the vehicle to be used on these small portions. So once again, we are using the MIG Ammo oil paint. The actual oil paint is not too important. This is mixed with some enamel thinner or white spirit or terps and made into a wash solution. And again, we apply it just into these localized areas. The idea is not to blot your brush or make contact with the pigment. You want, again, the wash to sort of naturally flow into the pigment accumulation and be dispersed throughout it. That way you get a very nice shade, obviously, but you haven't disturbed the three-dimensional aspect of that pigment. If your brush does touch it, you end up with a sort of smeared mess. It just ruins the effect of what you've done previously in sort of carefully building up those clumps of dirt. And once again, the wash is left to dry, and now we can have another look at the aspects of the vehicle. I continually re-evaluate the model during the weathering process, and here's one area I was not too happy with. It's the area where the turret ring would sit, and that area looks really clean on this model at the moment, and I think some work could be done here. So let's just go to work with the oils and just do a very quick effect. With the turret in place, we're going to use some of this MIG Starship sludge filth stuff. Anyways, it's like a mixture of a grey brown sort of oil paint. It looks pretty good. You can see what its intention is. That Starship filth name, don't worry about it being used for science fiction. It can be used on anything. So what we do is just apply this neat around the turret ring, remove the turret, and now we've got the wash, which is obviously a little bit too concentrated. So we're going to blend that somewhat using a larger brush dipped into enamel thinner or quick dry thinner, whatever you prefer to use, and start drawing out in a radial pattern filth as if it's come out of the turret ring and sort of deposit itself outwards towards the hull. We also, after a little while, repeat the process. Because we blended it a little bit too much, we'll apply another solution of the neat oil again and repeat the process. Also, we use a fan brush here to create this radial streaking outwards. Once we've got that blended and quite nice, we can also draw some streaks down that rear deck portion as well, and that looks a little bit better now. It looks a bit more in tune with the rest of the vehicle, i.e. it was an area that I sort of missed out during that first initial brown wash application. But now that's covered, let's move on to the next point. Obviously, when we started this video, one of the initial steps was this hairspray technique, and we've got these large chips on the vehicle. Somebody pointed out that large chips aren't actually realistic. I'm just going to bring up a reference photo. This is a T26 with very large chips of paint. However, that's not really what we're looking at the moment. I'm going to try and do some further indications of wear. So what we're doing is looking at some of the chips and maybe selecting a few that we can do some rust streaking on. For our rust streaks, we're going to use oil paints, and specifically going to use the Abteilung dark rust oil paint. The application here is not going to be a wash, it's going to be neat. So we'll apply it onto a cardboard palette just for convenience, and also can wick out some of that linseed oil. But these oils do go on straight away. They are a little bit drier than your artist oil. If you haven't got the Abteilung oils, the Winsor & Newton burnt sienna or burnt umber are very good typical browns as well that can be used for this technique. Now what we need to do is apply this very sparingly. I'm going to show you two techniques. The first one is using a very small brush point. We're going to apply a little dot of oil neatly onto areas of the tank, and then the next step is to streak it. We can go on the streaking straight away. There is no need to wait for any drying process or whatever. The secret of this streaking is to have a brush that is controllable and also slightly moist with some enamel thinner, because what you're going to do is draw the oil downwards as gravity would bring it and as these rust streaks appear in nature, but also you need to push the oils closer and closer together to create a concentrated streak. So really it's a matter of pushing these oils down. It is pretty straightforward. It's not that difficult a technique to do. The other thing that we can do as well is be selective as well in where you put these rust streaks and try and vary the size of them. It is probably not a good idea to hit every single chip. In this case, less is more is really the rule here. So we've gone in for a few areas and we've applied varying concentrations. Obviously the larger one is on the front of this hull. It's an area of visual interest. However, if you repeat this effect throughout the tank, it'll look monotonous and it'll be sort of a caricature of what you're trying to achieve. The idea here is that it's not entirely a rusty wreck. It's probably been out of action for a while. Weather has got to it. A bit of rust has happened and you've got this random corrosion streaks. In terms of applying as well, let's also have a look at a different method here. I'm using a toothpick to apply, and also a toothpick can be used to draw the oil paint down. If you practice at this, you may not need a brush. However, my favourite approach is to use a brush. And also, as demonstrated previously, you can see a portion there that I applied and that I removed. With these oil paints, if you make a mistake or you think the concentration is too much, it's a simple case of applying a bit more thinner on your brush, drawing it down, dabbing with a cloth and removing. It's as simple as that. Let's have another appreciation of the model. Are we happy with the rust streaks? Do they contrast enough? If so, we can move on to the next step. Okay, here's a little sort of break in the process here. We're going to weather up a metal bucket and add it to the model. By doing so, you've got a contrast point, and also makes it look a little bit more human as well, as if the actual vehicle has been used by humans. It hasn't been left there totally to rot. So using this plastic bucket, we're just basically coating it with chrome silver using one of these Tamiya pens, just very handy. All we need to do is apply that paint throughout and let it dry. After a couple of hours, it will be dry enough for the next step. We're going to use some neat oil paint and then just blend that with thinner. And that's just going to create a shade on top of the silver to take away the harsh contrast of that bright silver chrome paint. And then dip it into some pigments to make it as if the bucket was somehow sat on the earth at some point and then put on the tank. That's all that we're seeking to achieve. And then we can add this on as a nice little visual reference once we've completed the model. Okay, I'm just going to bring up a reference picture now. This is what we're going to try and achieve. We're going to try and achieve the effects of really accumulated dirt on top of what we already achieved in the last stage, which was those muddy tracks. We're going to enhance that effect. Let's have a look at how we're going to do it. First thing I'm going to use is a bit of this Holtex texture from VMS. This is a product that's designed for anti-slip surfaces, but also is a very, very fine sand or something like that. Anyways, we're going to use some pigments. We're going to use pigment fixer and also sand and gravel fixer. Let's get to work. Okay, let's start by applying the Holtex, which basically has this applicator bottle, and just apply it to certain areas. We're going to build up clumps of dirt which sort of forms pyramids on top of some of this suspension. And we need to build this up slowly in layers. It's going to take quite a while actually. So we start off with the Holtex, then we're going to add a pigment layer on top of that. The pigment's finer, it's actually easier to build into the piles, but also once we apply the fixer as well, it does sort of quickly blend down. So what we're going to do now is add the first layer of pigment fixer onto the model. The actual sand and gravel glue itself is a little bit stickier, a bit more like a really strong adhesive. The reason that we're doing this at the last step and not in the previous video is that this is going to be quite a delicate process, and really, even though we're using fixers, we're using the sand and gravel glue, by no means is it rigidly fixed on. In fact, if you just tap this with your finger, the effects will be destroyed. So we're just doing it right at the last minute to sort of build up this very special effect, which is going to look very convincing in the end. So we're repeating the process, more dust and dirt added on, more fixer. Now let's, as you probably already know, we're going to add some washes. Let's go for some two-tone effects. We're going to start this off with some dark effects using the slime, dark, liquid, greeny stuff, whatever. It's an enamel wash, it's very dark and has that really interesting sort of colour tone to it. The idea here is still to recreate the fact that there might be a little bit of damp mud just underneath, deeply underneath the suspension. So it's going to only get applied right at the back at these suspension mounting points where the running gears attach to the hull, and also a little bit of the road wheels. We aren't going to apply this everywhere, just in these few select points. The method of application is very much the same. Once again, we dip our brush into the mixture. This is neat, just the mixture just simply shaken up, and we dab on small amounts of the liquid which gets absorbed into the pigment. The next stage is to take some of the pigment again and tap on a little bit of the dry pigment so it gets absorbed by the wet liquid that's just been applied. By doing this, you don't sort of smooth out the pigment. You keep on giving it that three-dimensional, really gritty texture. So we keep on repeating this and repeating this until everything is built up. And for the second tone, of course, you already knew we're going to use the same dust wash that we used previously. This can be applied again over all the pigments. The idea again is the application is more important than the actual tone. We already know that we've got dry earth tones, but we need to apply this again very carefully so it does not get washed into the pigment and the pigment turns into a slime. If you touch it with a brush, you're going to get brush strokes there. It just will not look as convincing as this effect. And once again, we take our pigment, tap it back on all over these areas again, so we've still got that really three-dimensional gritty feel. All we need now is to wait for everything to dry and have a look at the final result. Okay, and another little touch we're going to do here, really simple. These are another product by Ammo Mig, and I think some other companies make them, but they are little paper cut leaves. We're going to use this contrasting green leaves that we can just place on the vehicle. It's sort of a semi-random type appearance, only a few of them. Let's just dot them on in a few places, and we use our tweezers to place them carefully. Once they're in place there, we need to fix them. And in this case, we're going to use the pigment fixer once again. So we'll just dip our brush into the pigment fixer and again just wick it onto the leaves, and they will stick down, allow it to dry, and everything's finished. Of course, you can vary this technique by adding many more leaves or different types of leaves, but for this is just simply demonstration products. And now let's have a look at the model. Okay, finally, after a period of 8 hours, all the pigments are dry again. This is the final look. Bear in mind what I said previously, they are delicate. Now, I must admit, this will look pretty good on a diorama, but we haven't actually got a base for this at the moment. Maybe in the future we'll come on to that, and we definitely will do some in the future. But you can see certainly the entire story is being told by this model now at this stage. What are your thoughts? What are your opinions? Do you like this effect? It's pretty easy. Do you like seeing more effects that have got a little bit more drama to them? Do you want to see things that are even pushed further? Well, we will be exploring them on the channel. And finally, I think we're approaching 1,000 subscribers, so I'm going to say thank you for that, but there will be a special video on top of that. Until then, we'll be having a new project next week and also an update on the channel. So take care, everybody, and thank you for watching and subscribing.